Congratulations! You clicked on my right hand, thus choosing to explore through the lens for the rights and opportunities of African Americans. Are you ready to learn about the contraction and expansion of the rights and opportunities through the eras of the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, and the New Deal? I sure am. First, we'll explore through the Gilded Age. During the Gilded Age, we see an expansion of opportunities, but however, we also see a contraction of rights of the African American citizens. Specifically, life in the Black South showed a huge expansion of opportunities for blacks economically, which was not present during the previous era. In the South, black laborers were employed from the economic developments of the South, such as mining, iron furnacing, and tobacco factories. Also, black farmers managed to acquire land. Specifically, in the Rice Kingdom of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, planters could not get the lands necessary to repair irrigation systems due from destruction from a previous war. Great plantations had increased in quality, thus resulting in blacks taking this land and taking up self-sufficient farming. Also in the southern cities, there was a significant uprising in institutions, consequently affecting the black population. The sudden uprising of institutions supported the growth of the black middle class. For example, the jobs like teachers, physicians, and businessmen like funeral directors and shopkeepers. However, we see a lack in the rights of African Americans. Labor markets were developed along social lines. Blacks were not allowed to have any supervisory jobs in factories and workshops and white-collar jobs. Black women were mainly domestic servants, but they were working for wages. In fact, a higher percentage of black women worked for wages than whites. These black women could not find employment as they were excluded. Local unions in the South excluded blacks in most occupations, thus another barrier for forming to their economic betterment. Furthering the loss of opportunities of the African American citizens, the rights of the blacks were restricted to a great extent. Starting from the 1890s, southern states enacted laws to eradicate the black vote. Laws were set in order to enable blacks from voting, such as the requirement for poll taxes, literary tests, knowledge of the state constitution, the grandfather clause, and lastly the requirement of the descendants of persons' eligibility to vote before the Civil War. Laws like these occurred as a means to purify politics by lowering fraud, violence, and the manipulation of voting rights against the populists and the Republicans. Laws like these also occurred in the response to the fear of the Negro denomination. Also known that these laws enacted by the states violated the 15th Amendment, that the federal government could not deny the citizen the right to vote. Also during the 1890s, there was a vast amount of segregation engraved in the Southern life, ultimately limiting the African American rights. The 1890s hosted a decade of segregation laws of the separation of black and whites. Methods in the Southern life such as separate schools, hospitals, waiting rooms, toilets, and cemeteries. Blacks were also negatively impacted by disenfranchisement, unequal economic status, and weak education. A great example of segregation of blacks and whites was the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Plessy was charged with violating the Louisiana Separate Car Act. Later, Plessy's lawyers argued the case should be dismissed for the law violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. The case was later brought to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896. Further expanding the contraction of the rights of the African American citizens came the rise of lynching in the South. Blacks that resisted the South's segregation systems faced lynching from white mobs. Overall, there was a huge departure from racial equality from the Reconstruction years and also in opposition with the laws written in the Constitution. Now we have examined the minimal expansion of rights/opportunities and also, on the other hand, the major contraction of these rights of African Americans during the Gilded Age. Let's continue this topic through the Progressive Age from the years 1900 to 1916. African Americans' disenfranchisement led to the African Americans not being able to participate in the progressives' idea of freedom. There was little to no access to industrial freedom, meaning that there was no regulation to limited work hours and conditions. Wages didn't help to lead to economic independence, and finally, blacks did not engage in the consumer economy. Last but certainly not least, let us finally view the rights and opportunities of African Americans during the New Deal era. During FDR's presidency, he enacted several laws in order to better America from the tragic events of the Great Depression through relief, recovery, and reform. The New Deal ultimately positively helped Americans back on their feet. However, the New Deal positively helped every nationality of American, but more specifically African Americans. FDR put together an administration that comprised of several federal leaders, Mary McLeod Bethune, a prominent black educator, Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, and Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, former president of the Chicago chapter of the NAACP. This administration's job was to promote the injustices of segregation, disenfranchisement, and lynching to the public. This decade hosted a major shift in black voting patterns. The North and the West enjoyed the right to vote. However, there was limit for broad reform for African Americans. Southern congressmen prevented the passage of anti-lynching laws, and FDR could not do anything to work around this block, for he could not risk losing his economic programs by singling out powerful members of the Congress. Also, the Civilian Conservation Corps made segregated work camps. Also, the Fair Labor Standards Act, Social Security, old age pensions, unemployment benefits, and the Minimum Wage Acts were not enjoyed by more than half of the African American men and women, for they are excluded from being agriculture and domestic workers. On a larger federal note, African American blacks witnessed a major contraction of rights. There was a requirement that housing built or financially aided by the federal government had to be racially segregated. The Federal Housing Administration did not provide mortgages that had clauses in which allowed future sales to non-white customers. Also, the Federal Housing Administration did not channel money into integrated neighborhoods. Furthermore, the federal employment practices discriminated on the basis of race. Out of 1,500 blacks, only 2% of those blacks held a federal job other than a clerk or custodian, suggesting the exclusion of blacks to federal positions. In the South, some New Deal construction projects did not hire any blacks at all. Now that we have examined the very little expansion of the opportunities, but the major contraction of rights for African Americans, it will be beneficial to look at the contemporary issues if ultimately these major contraction of rights and opportunities still existed. We see a major expansion of rights and opportunities through the marvelous efforts of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was an African American civil rights activist that strived to eliminate segregation of blacks and whites and ultimately get equality. Martin Luther King Jr.'s effect on America was long-lasting and integrated blacks and whites together as equals. However, we still do see racism in today's society. Cases such as Rodney King, a construction worker beaten by an LA officer for no apparent reason, and Trayvon Martin, who was shot and killed by George Zimmerman from him looking suspicious. America still has a ways to go with racism, but progress has definitely been made.